Welcome to our Maundy Thursday worship experience. I'm Pastor Jeremy, and I'm glad to be worshiping with you. We've been doing a lot of things differently during our time of social distancing, and tonight's worship experience is going to be different as well. Maundy comes from the Latin word mandatum, meaning commandment. And this is the night that we usually remember Jesus washing his disciples' feet and giving a new commandment to love one another as Jesus loved them. And those stories come from the Gospel of John. So I usually preach some kind of sermon on that, and we generally avoid washing each other's feet because we're kind of squeamish about it. But we do usually celebrate communion, since that's something that Jesus does to say goodbye to his disciples in other Gospels. Then we strip the altar of all paraments and banners, of communion elements and candlesticks, reminding us that Jesus went to the cross alone. I thought about having us wash our own feet, and then I figured that's not really service to others. You might as well just take a bath. So instead of any of that, I've decided that I'd like to take you on a brief journey of Jesus' last days using pictures from my Holy Land trips. I will tell you a bit of the story, mostly following the Gospel of Matthew's story, show some pictures, and offer some time for reflection at each point when we listen to or sing When Jesus Wept, an early American spiritual song by William Billings. I hope this time of worship offers some insight for you into what Jesus went through to show love for all people, something that is just as important to remember now as always. We begin with an overview of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. It is from here that Jesus rode into Jerusalem, down the hill, across the valley, and into the city, possibly through the Golden Gate, which was open in Jesus' time but has been walled up since medieval times. Jesus would have entered right by the Temple Mount then, and he goes there to turn the tables on the merchants next in Matthew's narrative. As I said in this past Sunday sermon, Passover was a pilgrimage festival, and there would have been lots of people coming from far away to Jerusalem, perhaps up to 100,000 people. The changing of money and buying of animals for sacrifice was necessary for people to complete their Passover celebrations. And what Jesus was possibly protesting was not the act of buying and selling of things in the temple, but that the money changers were stealing from the poor with unfair exchange rates. Let us pause here to reflect on how Jesus shows his love for people by pointing out inequality. When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around. After a variety of scenes in Matthew, where Jesus continues to point out faithlessness and hypocrisy, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. A church called Dominus Flevit, meaning the Lord has wept, commemorates the scene. And after some apocalyptic visions of the destruction of the temple, it appears Jesus has made enough of a stir to be considered dangerous. He retreats to Bethany, where his friend Mary anoints him with costly perfume, a symbolic anointing for his coming death, and his friend Judas agrees to betray him. Let us pause here to reflect on Jesus' love that weeps for a people and a city that he sees not helping their neighbors or seeking the good of all. When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around. Now I've moved to a model, which is at the Jerusalem Museum. And this model is of the city when the Second Temple was there. Jesus lived during the late part of this Second Temple period, and I'm now showing you a gate that is probably near where Jesus and his disciples had their Last Supper in an upper room. This gate is called the Sen Gate. Matthew neglects to mention, but Mark and Luke talk about a man carrying a jug of water. Typically, men would not carry jugs of water except in the case of a religious sect like the Essenes, which was all men. So it's likely that the upper room was in one of these houses in this part of the city. It is in one of these houses where Jesus has a meal with his disciples, where at the end of the meal he reinterprets the bread and wine as being ways to remember him. In the Gospel of John, he washes feet instead, and gives a new commandment to love one another as he loves them. Let us pause here to reflect on Jesus' love based on service for each other, rather than power over each other.
When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around.
Now we go back out of the city to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus prays in the garden, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." The Church of all nations is built over a rock where Jesus is supposed to have wept and prayed this prayer. It is also in the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus' disciples fall asleep 3 times, and where Jesus is betrayed by Judas with a kiss and arrested. On our trip, we celebrated communion in the Garden of Gethsemane, remembering Jesus' gift of love. Let us pause here to reflect on Jesus' love as a gift.
When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around.
Back to the model. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, did not live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea by the sea, and only came into Jerusalem when he needed to. With Passover being a large pilgrimage festival, he felt he needed to be there to keep the peace. So this palace is likely where he lived while in Jerusalem. Pilate is often portrayed as not understanding why Jesus is considered a threat. But in the end, we know that it was Pilate, and not King Herod or Caiaphas the high priest, who would have had to order his death. This is the courtyard where the crowds would have asked for Barabbas' release instead of Jesus' release, and would have cried, "Crucify him." Let us pause here to reflect on Jesus' love that sees the bigger picture.
When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around.
After Jesus was handed over to be crucified, he was mocked by soldiers. There was a game at the time called the King Game, where someone would get to dress a prisoner up as a mock king. This is possibly the game board for it etched into the stone. This is a place called the Lithostratos, or Gabbatha, the stone pavement. This is where Jesus was flogged and mocked, and traditionally where the trial by Pilate took place. Let us pause here to reflect on Jesus' love that doesn't keep score.
When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around.
And then Jesus walked down what is now called the Via Dolorosa, the way of grief, accompanied by his cross, to a place outside the city where he was to be crucified. As he left the Lithostratos, he passed under this arch called Hadrian's Arch, which is where Pilate said, "Behold the man, ecce homo," in the Gospel of John. The end of his walk down the Via Dolorosa is what we now know as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is a church built over the rock of Golgotha, of Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. At the time, it was just outside the city. More likely than not, Jesus was crucified just above eye level, not high on a hill far away, as a favorite hymn suggests. But as much as that seems less romantic, it also seems more theologically significant to me. Jesus suffered with us to the end, even to death, eye to eye with those he came to save. Let us pause here one final time to reflect on Jesus' self-giving love that loves us as we are and loves us even to death.
When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond all bound. When Jesus groaned, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around.
And so we have journeyed with Jesus, and I hope you found this to be a meaningful part of your Holy Week experience. Please join me again tomorrow with a variety of readers from our congregation who will lead us through a Tenebrae service, a recounting of the Passion narrative based on the Gospel of John as we extinguish candles and descend into darkness. And now go in peace, and may God be with you this day and always. Amen.